Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, this is a 2-video series on how to replace these bias pots in your Muzishare X7. Okay, so we got this pair of potentiometers rebuilt or replaced, like I showed in the earlier video. And there's what our new mil-spec pots look like. And one of the reasons I was showing you to do these one at a time and to not do both sides at once is so you can compare one side to the other, make sure you don't get the green and the yellow swapped out, and you can obviously look at the top of the amp and make sure that the potentiometer that's feeding the grid is the same as all the lettering. But as you can see here, we want to make sure that we put this resistor pack, or these pair of resistors, into the right holes on this little printed circuit board. And you can look at the other side to make sure that you're putting them in the right place so that the bias adjustment will work in the correct direction when you're turning it. So the resistor goes to there, and then the white will go from here and here, and the black wire connects there. As you can see, this side is identical, and the yellow and green are also the same. The green goes to this tube, the yellow goes to this tube, and the same will be on the other side. This will be the green, and this will be the yellow. Now you can see our new addition here. We have our little test jacks that come up through the top of the amp. And that way we can check the voltage on the cathode, which will be converted to the milliamps through the tube by the voltage drop across the 10 ohm resistor. So if the meters die in the future, no worries, you can still run the amp. You just have to have a digital voltmeter, and you can check the voltage and set the bias on it with these new trim pots. So the failure point, which we pointed out, the switch gets corroded. If that does happen in the future, the amp's not junk and you can still use it. So we want to go ahead and connect these test points up to the cathodes. And so we're going to first look at which one goes where. And we said before, the yellow goes here, the green goes there. So this front pot goes to this tube, and the back pot goes to that tube. So, and by the front and back I mean this one and this one. So this one goes to this tube, so let's hook up a red wire to our test jack point, and just want to wrap the wire around this terminal on the top of the test jack point. However, you need to do it like that, and then we come in with our soldering iron and solder that wire onto this test jack point. Just like that. And make sure the barrel of your soldering iron doesn't touch any of the other wires and burn the insulation off of them. So we're going to wrap this guy around like that, and it's going to come up here and go to this point right here, the same connection point where this red wire that goes to the front meter goes. And obviously you don't have to use color-coded wire if you don't have them. And this doesn't need to be very thick wire. It can be like 22 gauge wire because there's very little current going through this, if any at all, because all it's doing is giving you a measuring point on the top of the amp for the cathode voltage. And like I said, we're only talking like a half a volt of electricity, so it's far from being some sort of danger having those test points on the top. And I'll show you what they look like once we get this potentiometer wired up. We'll flip the amp over and take a look at that. So next we want to come in here, and there we go. And then I'm going to come in with a white wire, just because they do have the different colors. We'll stick with the factory color coding and wrap it around this test jack point. Solder this wire on. And this one's going to come across and go over there. We'll cut a little extra length and we'll go under. We'll thread it underneath those other ones. And strip a little bit of wire off. And then I'll go ahead and tin the end of this wire. Just get a little solder on it. Then we don't have to worry about the strands getting stray and causing a problem somewhere. And might be a little easier to grab this with a little pair of pliers to come in here. And there we go. Now we have this test jack hooked up to this cathode, and this test jack hooked up to that cathode, and it's all happy now. So the next thing we want to do is we need to reconnect the wires to these little potentiometers. This one's going to go here. I'm going to strip back just a little more of the wire. We're going to add a little solder there. And then solder this black wire, these two resistors. Like that. And then you need to pull the insulation back like that. And then get this blob of solder off. And then fold this wire over and get it like that, so we can put it through this hole. And then come in on the back side and solder that wire into that hole in the printed circuit board. Like that. And then the other side of this white wire goes into the other circuit board. And you can see originally they had just like a millimeter of wire exposed. And we're going to trim it back and get a little more. And then come in and solder this second one. And then we'll have the negative voltage in the ground hooked up to these potentiometers. And then the next thing we'll do is solder this yellow wire onto the grid here. And then solder this green wire onto this terminal here that goes to the grid of the other two. Like that. And that's going to give us our negative voltage onto the grids of the output tubes to bias those tubes up for us. So, like I was saying earlier, there's little washers that help keep this board flat. And we want to put those back in place. It's a lot easier if you just get a little touch of some kind of like contact cement. Doesn't take much, just a little tiny bit. It'll hold that washer in place for you when you're locating the little bias boards. Because if not, they will just endlessly fall off while you're trying to set that in place and get the screws started. And make sure our little test wires are out of the way. And we're going to put our screws in. And we'll have these bias pots all upgraded and have our new chest jacks installed. And this is probably the hardest part of this whole deal, is dealing with these bias pots. Honestly, it's one of the nicer parts of updating these amps, is it makes the bias adjustment so much easier with those screws sticking slightly above the surface of the amplifier. So the last thing you want to do is turn the amp on its side and center the shafts for these potentiometers in the holes in the top of the chassis. So let me do that, and then I'll show you what that looks like. So here's what the final installation looks like. You can see where we have these test jacks. You can still easily read the numbers for the tube that it goes with, and then this screw is V1, which is this tube, and then this jack would measure the voltage. Same here, this is valve 2, which is this tube, and this is where you'd measure the voltage. Again, use the meter as long as it works, but if the meter does break, this gives you an alternate way of measuring the cathode voltage without having to buy some sort of a, adapter thing that the tube plugs into and then plugs into the tube socket and all that mess. You can just directly measure them here, because this is how I do it on my personal cathode biased amps. I don't use a meter, I just put little test jacks on it, and then you would use this for the positive and then touch this for the ground. So I think that turned out really nice. And I did check, and the cage still fits over the top of these. They're not in the way of the cage sitting on there. So really no reason not to do this when you're working on one of these amps. And I think this is a good place to wrap up this video. So I think this is going along really smoothly. The only thing we have left to do is replace the coupling caps, and unfortunately I only had 4, and there's 6 that we're going to be replacing. 6. And yeah, waiting on those to come in the mail. Now, I said in an earlier video, the 2 that have the most impact are these .22 UF, these 2 big guys. There's a smaller .33 UF film cap that's on the tail of the phase splitter. it doesn't really have as much of an impact. But since the guy sent this here and said he wants the full upgrades, I'm going to be replacing that 0.33 UF cap with a Mundorf EVO aluminum oil cap as well. And it adds about $30 to the cost of the upgrade. And again, you can decide if or whether, whatever you want to do that one. But like I said, I'm doing this because it's here. He's paying all the shipping to get it here. I'm not going to skimp on that. So anyway, that's really all we've got left. And one of the things, and the reason it's here, is the switching device, or that knob that switches between VU meter, bias, different tubes. That's the failure point in this amp. Everyone that's been sent to me, that's been the problem. And in an earlier video, I showed how to replace that switch with something that I had hoped was an upgrade to this switch that's in here, and turns out 6 months later it had the same problem. And so the guy figured out some other way to set the bias, and he was like, it sounds great, I don't fault you, the part died, I'm not expecting you to, warranty and go in there and replace that switch again, I'll just figure out another way to do it, which is what these test jacks I've installed do. They give you another way to check the bias. What I think happens with these switches is they get corroded from non-use. Most people rarely touch that switch, and maybe every few months, they might turn it, or when they replace the tubes, they're messing with it. A lot of people don't even know what bias is, and they just run the amp. And so, and then the problem becomes when people, they turn the bias checking switch, or, that's supposed to engage the meter, and they don't see, it's either pegged or it's all the way to the left, and then they start screwing around with the bias screws when they were probably fine, but now they've got the bias out of whack, and they got no way of measuring what it is to adjust it back right. So if you go to check the bias, if the amp sounds good, and you go to check the bias, and the meter's acting wonky, just don't touch anything unless you're ready to go inside the amp. What I am going to do is I'm going to put some deoxit on these switches. And that's what I'm going to recommend to people. If you've got one of these that the meter's acting wonky, spray the inside of these switches with some deoxit D5 and then work the switch. Or even before that, just work the switch back and forth and see if the meter starts working. These are self-cleaning type switches where if you operate it enough, it should clean the contacts off and start working again. The other thing that you can do to help avoid this problem is operate that switch once a week, or if you just get in the habit of every time when you turn the amp on, turn the amp on and then rotate those switches back and forth, through each of the settings, and that'll keep those contacts clean, and you likely will never have this problem. I will come back and show you replacing these coupling caps when they come in. It might be another week or two, but we're basically finished with the difficult part of upgrading these amps. And it's one of the reasons I really like this Muzishare over the Wilsonton R8, or at least the early version. The Mark IIs, which, they're claiming there's no Mark II. Well, I'm not going to get into that today, but if you get the later version, they did do a star ground point like this is, with a singular ground point, which solved all the problems that it had with weird noises and stuff. And this amp did it from day one. They used a single star ground point on this big cap, and then just the whole layout and everything inside it is just an improvement to me. And personally, I think these 9-pin tubes sound better than those octal tubes do. Now, a 6S7 is a really good sounding tube, and I don't take that away from Wilsonton for using those, but this amp has not only the advantage of using the 9-pin 12AX7 type voltage amplification tube, which the Gold Lions sound so good in this amp, and I've even put those Gold Lion tubes on adapters in an R8, and that definitely sounds better as well. But you've got a actual rectifier tube that's rectifying the voltage going to the front end tubes, and the front end tubes are on a separate rail of the power supply than the output tubes, which is, man, it's a huge advantage to have this type of dual rectification power supply. They actually have a silicon bridge rectifier, and then they've got a tube rectifier that's separate that does the front end tubes, and it keeps those two apart from each other so the current draw of the output tubes doesn't put noise into the voltage that's going to the front end tubes. And so, yeah, I really like this little amp. Anyway, hope you're enjoying this video. If you are, please subscribe. Please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters and other folks that do other things to support Skunkie Designs. Until the next video, have a nice day.